Good evening. You're very welcome to this important seminar at the Institute of Irish Studies here at Queen's. I'm Margaret O'Callaghan. I'm Acting Director of the Institute at the moment, and I'm really pleased to introduce you to two really interesting speakers who've produced a very important book here today. So we have the great benefit of having a large audience here on the square in Queen's, and we've got a lot of people coming in online as well. So I think that's a tribute to the interest that there is in this new book, Ties That Bind, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Union, edited by Graham Walker and James Greer. Graham is well known to almost everybody here and indeed many online as Emeritus Professor of Political History here at Queen's Belfast. He's published widely on the subject of Irish and Scottish history. He's published an awful lot on Ulster Unionism and politics and on the politics of sport. James Greer's publications have focused on the political history of Ulster Unionism, the Troubles, British and Irish Labour, Irish Presbyterianism. His research has also explored the politics of European integration and literature and popular culture in 20th century Northern Ireland. Ties That Bind, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Union is an engrossing and extremely timely study of the historical, cultural and political relationship between Scotland and Northern Ireland. And this is, I think, a seminal moment in the constitutional history of both places. It's seldom been acknowledged and rarely explored in any real depth. The depth of the extent of that tie and the mutual reflections between both places have rarely been explored in any real depth. But this important book conclusively demonstrates just how deeply entwined Scotland and Northern Ireland are, particularly in constitutional and other ways. The book explores how Scottish Ulster ties acted as a bridge between Britain and Ireland, and it will be central to contemporary debates regarding Britishness, sectarianism, devolution. It reveals the connections and tensions between ascendant Scottish nationalism, Brexit, and deadlock in Northern Ireland, and argues that, rather than the inevitable collapse of the UK, these challenges show that the constitutional future of Scotland and Northern Ireland are both very much still up for grabs. So it's exciting to introduce, first of all today, Graham Walker to give a short-ish to long paper about the book, and then James will follow, slightly shorter paper. We've kind of made things a bit difficult for James by denying him access to some overheads that he had, but all will be fine. So you're very welcome, and we will have time for questions and answers at the end. Thank you. You're very welcome, Graham.
Thanks very much, Margaret, and hello everyone. Thank you for attending, both here in the room and online. Yes, as Margaret said, I'll talk in pretty general terms about the book, about what we hope to achieve with the book, and then James will look at certain themes in more depth, themes that have been covered in the final chapter of the book. I want to start with, as indeed we start in the book, with a comment from a local political journalist, Newton Emerson, who I'm sure will be familiar to most of you here. And it was last summer in one of his columns in the Irish Times, he wrote how it was remarkable how little Scotland features in contemporary Northern Ireland politics, and indeed vice versa. So I think one of the objectives of the book was certainly to try and provide people with some encouragement, I suppose, to appreciate more the politics of Scotland if they're over here, and the politics of Northern Ireland if they're in Scotland. However, I think that there are some difficulties here. If I might now proceed to another comment, this time by a Scottish academic, Professor David McCrone. David McCrone recently contributed a piece to this journal, Scottish Affairs, the latest Scottish Affairs, part of which is given over to a series of articles about Scotland and the two Irelands, as they call it. And David McCrone's piece is in the form of a review article of Susan Mackay's books on Ulster Protestants. The title of the review article itself is quite interesting, A Faraway Place Close at Hand. And McCrone picks up on one of the interviewees in Mackay's book, who said that if Scotland went independent, this would be it. The game would be up, basically, for Ulster Unionists or Loyalists. They would be defeated, in effect. McCrone is sceptical about this, and he goes on to say, and I'll quote him here, because Scotland has had no real part to play in this Irish drama, not even much of a minor walk-on. The most that one can say is that it's hard to see, like fog in the North Channel, how a future plays out. There is every reason to think that Scotland will only see Northern Ireland on those few days when the political weather allows. Okay, Professor McCrone lives and works in Edinburgh, which might be significant. He's a sociologist and not a historian, which also might be relevant. I have to say quickly here that I've admired Professor McCrone's work for some time, and indeed we reference some of it in the book. But in this issue, I think, he's very much mistaken. I mean, the idea that if Scotland goes independent, it will not have a profound effect here in Northern Ireland, and obviously Northern Ireland Unionists, I think, would be affected most of all, but not exclusively. Not so long ago, another local commentator, Paul Nolan, wrote in Fortnight that Scottish independence would be the biggest challenge for relationships in Ireland, actually, he put it. Also, I think that if things change dramatically over here, as many expect they will in terms of possible referendum and Irish unity and so on, I mean, the idea then that would not affect Scotland, I think, is wrong. If only in the west of the country, far away from Professor McCrone, or out of sight. Now, my serious point is that there are many Scotlands, and there is certainly one that cares about Northern Ireland and cares about relations between Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, the second part of David McCrone's statement there that I read out to you, I think in some ways is more valid. Because if he means that many in Scotland cannot comprehend politics in Northern Ireland or don't want to comprehend politics in Northern Ireland, and conversely, I think a lot of people here do not really understand what is going on in Scotland, or perhaps have an oversimplified view of what's happening, then I think this is true. And perhaps again, there are those, and I'm thinking particularly of unionists, who maybe don't want to look too hard at the moment at what's happening in Scotland because they fear what they will see. Our book, I think, accepts that these attitudes are out there. That what Newton Emerson says is eminently correct at the moment. But we want to show that Scotland and Northern Ireland are closely entwined politically as well as culturally, and indeed have been for a long time. We are trying to bring to light these political connections, to bring to light unappreciated, maybe also unacknowledged or obscured connections of this kind. And of course, we are very aware, as Margaret has pointed out in her introduction, of how central both Scotland and Northern Ireland are to the question of the future of the UK Union. I want us to, if we could move to the next slide, which you can only see over there, I'm aware, and it's the contents of the book. And I really just want to say something about the different chapters before I pass over to James. The first chapter, which is entitled Shared History Across the Narrow Sea. This is about the historical background. It's an appraisal of the many historical connections of a social, cultural, economic, and yes, political kind over the centuries. The focus in this chapter in particular, I think, is on how the Irish Home Rule debate affected Scotland and prompted ideas about reform of the whole UK at the time. This would be the late 19th, early 20th century. Ideas about home rule all round, which in many ways still have a relevance today. They still resonate in some ways, obviously in changed political circumstances. That leads on to a chapter about devolution, which of course is a theme that brings both places quite clearly together. Northern Ireland, of course, the first part of the UK to get devolution or legislative devolution. And I say legislative devolution because in the period from 1921, when Northern Ireland got its own parliament, a system of what scholars have come to call administrative devolution was developing in Scotland. And it's quite instructive, I think, to look at these, to compare them, and to realise just how misleading the idea of the UK as a unitary state really is. To quote the late political scientist Bernard Crick, it's much more appropriate to refer to the way that the United Kingdom has worked over the years as de facto federalism. So this chapter is looking at that. It's looking at how Northern Ireland's devolution was a model, I suppose, for other parts of the UK. In the late 1940s, for example, in Scotland, there was quite an intense debate about devolution. There was a great stir in the country about establishing a Scottish Parliament. And at the time, the Northern Ireland example was admired. It was looked at as being the template in many ways for devolution in Scotland. Now, this, of course, reflected a very different climate of opinion at the time, where in Scotland there was appreciation for the fact that Northern Ireland had played such an important role in the Second World War, in the Allied war effort. So that helps to explain, I suppose, why there was a favourable look across the narrow sea. So we look at that period, which I don't think is very well known. And then, of course, we look at the 1960s onwards, when the devolution debate in the whole UK really took off, and where successive governments in the 1970s were faced with the two challenges, in effect, of trying to bring peace and stability back to Northern Ireland, and at the same time pushing on with devolution or new arrangements for governance in Scotland and Wales. And of course, all of this culminated in that transformative moment of constitutional change at the end of the 20th century, when the Blair Labour government brought in devolution for Scotland and Wales, and of course the Good Friday Agreement provided for the restoration of devolution on power sharing basis to Northern Ireland, which completely changed the landscape, political landscape, constitutional landscape of the United Kingdom. Now, this again led us to look at the question of British identity, and just as Northern Ireland and Scotland were linked over the question of devolution and the experience of devolution, so too I think are they very much connected around this theme of British identity. I think to a great extent, just as they were, Scotland and Northern Ireland were the main drivers of the debate over constitutional change and reform in the UK, certainly from the 60s and 70s onwards. So too, I think they were the main drivers of what could be called the interrogation of British identity and what it might mean. Now, this debate, of course, has developed quite significantly. There's now very significant English participation in this debate, but it has only come about very recently. The cause of the union in Scotland for a long time was the union with Ireland and Northern Ireland. The notion of varieties of Britishness, I think, can best be illustrated with reference to both Scotland and Northern Ireland. In this chapter on the British question, we try to take account of a lot of recent scholarship on this topic, and there has been a great outpouring on this. And in so doing, we are taking issue with those scholars who simply lop off Northern Ireland, don't consider it, discount it. So that in their discussions and their explorations of the meaning of British identity, they have nothing to say, basically, about an Irish dimension. They consider it too inconvenient or problematic. I'm inclined to blame Linda Colley for this, because brilliant as her book Britons was when it was published in 1992, it simply didn't engage with Ireland. It simply left it out. And I think a lot of people have come after her and have done the same thing. By contrast, we follow historians such as Hugh Kearney, most recently David Reynolds in his book Island Stories, Alvin Jackson, and Bernard Crick, a political scientist, who all, I think, see the inclusion of Ireland / Northern Ireland as essential to this conversation. And I think we would go further, or we do go further in the book, in suggesting that Ulster / Northern Ireland / the north of Ireland, whatever way you want to call it, is in many ways a key to understanding the varieties, the complexities, the ambiguities, the messiness or the slipperiness of Britishness as an idea, British identity. Okay, that brings me to chapter 4, which I've called the Ulsterisation of Scottish politics. Now, if and when this is reviewed in Scotland, this will be the focus, and there will be a lot of pushback from people in Scotland who just don't like this term. Because, and this brings us back, I think, to what David McCrone said, and I don't want to use him as a punch bag, but I mean, it's a useful quote, I think, to try and illustrate how, in Scotland anyway, in certain circles, media circles, political circles, and so on, there really is a profound reluctance to draw comparisons between Scotland and Northern Ireland. The term Ulsterisation, therefore, is controversial, but we would defend the usage of this term with reference to the way that politics in Scotland has, or political preoccupations have narrowed to a very significant extent. That the constitutional issue now towers above everything else, that other issues are subordinate to it. The way that parties and so on debate other issues tends to be through the lens of the constitutional question. And where else is that the case? Here. And here, of course, it's been the case for a long time. Equally, I think that, and this certainly won't go down well, is that the Scottish National Party in many ways now is behaving as if it's a one-party state. There certainly is a sense that there is one-party dominance in Scotland, and that there is one issue dominance in Scotland, and all of that, I think, is reminiscent of the way Northern Ireland used to be. Then there is a question of the language which has come into Scottish politics. Now it is commonplace for the terms unionist and nationalist to be used. Now, up until even about 15 years ago, this was not the case. It was, and this I think is reflective of the way that the salience of the politics of social class in Scotland has declined or has been obscured. And this, I think, again, pushes us, Scotland, towards a frame of comparison with Northern Ireland. Now, as I say, there's been a lot of pushback about this. Some of it rather crude and crass, I would have to say. You know, where are the car bombs type of thing? Well, you know, let's hope it never, ever happens like that. But that does not invalidate the use of the term Ulsterisation. Certainly, the examples I've given would stand over as being the case. And then there is also the very vexed question of sectarianism. In Scotland, after the Parliament was set up, the topic of sectarian divisions in the country became a very hot one. All sorts of summit meetings were held, reports were commissioned. One of them actually edited or presided over by an academic from Northern Ireland, Dr. Duncan Morrow. And the media, to some extent, got obsessed with the issue. And this is a theme that clearly brings Scotland into a frame of comparison with Northern Ireland. The issues around sectarianism in Scotland have their roots in Irish influences in Scottish life, and they fed off the conflict in Northern Ireland. On the other hand, even although there has been much attention given to sectarianism, and that in many ways those who have been in Holyrood, the Scottish Parliament, since its inception, have been preoccupied with it, again, I would suggest that there is a reluctance to push the comparison with Northern Ireland too far. Now, clearly there are very great differences in terms of the scale and the character of sectarian divisions in Scotland compared to Northern Ireland, but there are also similarities. And as I say, the roots of those divisions, particularly in the west of Scotland, I think are very clearly from over here. So again, I suppose what I'm saying is that our book is trying to investigate a relationship which has been a close one culturally, but a very awkward one politically. One that a lot of people don't really want to talk about very much. And we seek to explain this political relationship in a way which hopefully will lead to more positive and fruitful interaction. And as a final thought, I suppose I would throw out the idea that revitalizing those arguments and ideas and frameworks of the late 20th century moment of constitutional reform, which I referred to, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed and devolution came to Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. I think this could help in this current climate. It would mean a return to the pluralistic temper of that time and a step back from the binary either-or divisions which currently dominate political discourse. I'll hand over to James now, and he can take things on with some reference to the final chapter of the book.
Thank you, Graham, and just want to thank Margaret and everybody at Irish Studies for hosting us today. And this PowerPoint presentation I have is getting better with every minute that you can't see it, so that's going to work out well. But really, I just want to make a few points about these issues in the era of referendum politics in Northern Ireland and Scotland and across the UK, obviously relating to the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 and the Brexit vote of 2016, and the potential, some would say likelihood or possibility, of border polls in both jurisdictions maybe down the line. So to just take a step back, I think it is quite remarkable that uncertainty regarding the short-term survival of the UK has become a strangely normalised and accepted fact of political life here for over a decade. Now, for those with an appreciation of Northern Ireland's history, commonly held assumptions about the end of the Union are nothing new. In each decade of Northern Ireland's existence, its demise has been confidently predicted. A section of Irish nationalism has been convinced of victory in each of these decades. And equally, strands of Welsh unionism have really enjoyed a kind of extreme pessimism about their own imminent doom in each of these decades. And that's the case even in the docile environment for unionism in the years after the Second World War that Graham mentioned. You had strands of unionists thought you had this very fatalistic view. But the very real possibility, some would say likelihood, some would say 50-50, of Scotland exiting the Union that they joined in 1707 in Great Britain is something both new and more profound for the UK. While we did have in the 1970s a short surge of popularity for the SNP, where they got about a third of the vote at one stage, and we had an academic literature about the speculating about the breakup of Britain that emerged in the 1970s, well, that did happen, but that doesn't really compare with what we're living through in our time now. You know, we've had SNP dominance in Scotland since 2011, a consistently 45% plus of Scots supporting independence. And, you know, we should note that this was largely unforeseen by historians, social scientists, political scientists, not to make people feel too bad. You know, this is something very profound for the UK and something new with the size of Scotland within the Union. The implications of sustained SNP popularity, of nationalism's dominance of civic and cultural life in Scotland, and of the sheer popularity of the yes message has become strangely normalised, as I said, but not yet fully grasped, and that's part of what we're trying to achieve in the book. Long accustomed to constitutional instability coming just from Northern Ireland, centres of power and opinion formers in GB have struggled to respond coherently to the intertwined challenges now coming from Belfast and Edinburgh. The approach of successive UK governments to the shaky architecture of the evolved UK has too often been fragmented, piecemeal, lacking long-term strategy, and unwilling to think seriously about what connects and what divides the constituent parts of the United Kingdom. The challenges to the Union are pretty clear to see. We start off with Scotland, mentioned the decade, the remarkable dominance of the SNP, either in majority government or just short of majority rule in a devolved system designed to stop majority rule, designed to stop Scottish Labour majority rule initially. You have to look at the demographics of the Yes movement in Scotland, very popular, particularly most younger demographics, younger voters, and the fact that SNP support has withstood the rather astonishing civil war between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, and withstood the fact that their record in government in some policy areas is perhaps less than impressive, thinking of health, shipyards, etc., etc. In Northern Ireland, the challenges for unionism are equally clear, equally stark. It has lost the right to hold the First Minister's position, if we ever have First Minister again. And despite the threat, from a union's point of view, of a Sinn Féin First Minister, the DUP were all able to rally support to the traditional vote for us to stop a Sinn Féin First Minister, and unionism remained fractured in that environment. And the major unionist parties have so far failed to win back support that has drifted towards the Alliance Party. Okay. We also have at this moment in time unionism led by a pretty traditional brand of Ulster unionism, just at the time where self-identifying Protestants are now a minority of the population in Northern Ireland for the first time. And this is the party that also held significant sway within UK politics from 2017 to 2019. And really, what did they have to show from that other than what they would view as a defeat of the protocol? So this is not a particularly good moment for unionism in either places. But I think what's also, big but, then pause, what's also striking, I think, and maybe the further we move away from this period of, let's say, 2016, 2014 to 2022, is that if we consider the context of Brexit, we consider Prime Minister Johnson, Truss, we consider the economic performance of the UK, consider all these different factors, we sort of argue that in many ways it's remarkable that Irish nationalism and Scottish nationalism has not made a more decisive breakthrough given this context. You know, Brexit and a Prime Minister like Johnson, you know, they could have been genetically modified to alienate parts of Middle Scotland and even just parts of Middle Ulster as well. Yet the polls for Scottish independence have remained broadly static. We had polling at the weekend which showed the Unionist side in 53, that pro-independence 47. We've had other polls recently where that's been flipped. But essentially Scotland remains split down the middle on this issue. And in Northern Ireland, we can see that undoubtedly Brexit has strengthened the nationalism of many soft nationalists within Northern Ireland. That's undoubtedly seems to have been the case, and has also greatly irritated and annoyed many other people within Northern Ireland. But as yet, there is not significant evidence of a massive converts to the nationalist cause in Northern Ireland. And this is the case either in polling data is variable, but if we take, you know, the actual election results for people voting for capital N nationalist parties, that's essentially at the same level now as it was in 1998, 1999. Okay. And, you know, I would just say, obviously, there's a lot of energy in some circles about discourse of a new Ireland, a new nationalism, a shared island, this kind of language. The question that we would ask is, where is the political vehicle that's going to incorporate maybe the members of the other non-aligned community in Northern Ireland that undoubtedly is there? Where's the evidence that there's a political vehicle that's going to incorporate those people? And then, you know, just as to continue that point, I think it is notable how, with the dominance of Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, or within nationalism and the dominance of the DUP within unionism, that the imperatives of party politics in this part of the world, of rallying the base, etc., still run counter to the imperatives of border poll politics of how to win potential converts to your constitutional position. Neither of these parties are ideally placed to win converts to their position. Just to talk more broadly, to pan out a little bit about referendum politics across the UK. I think it's notable, you think of 2014 and 2016, firstly, just how high the turnouts are in both referendums, the incredible level of civic engagement that happened in both referendums. I think it's also interesting in an international comparison, to think about the process in 2014, where essentially the SNP government were allowed to set the question and the time of the referendum, and the UK government was kind of laissez-faire about that process. Obviously, that's changed now, but that is remarkable and in many ways to reflect upon that process. But with regards to this level of civic engagement and high turnout, we don't really see much evidence that all this energy has produced either a healthier democratic culture in these jurisdictions, or a closer relationship between voters with power, or actually the small matter of better public policy. Together, referendum politics has pushed these complex issues into restrictive binary choices. For those on the pro-union side of the argument, this is where we lose some friends, we kind of argue that Brexit has weakened some of the historic strengths of the Union and the appeal of Britishness. Scotland and Northern Ireland obviously voting to remain, being taken out of the EU in that context. Interestingly, that's in contrast to the vote in 1975, where all parts of the United Kingdom voted to stay in the EEC at that time. This vote in 2016 put various conceptions of consent, legitimacy, national sovereignty, it put them up against each other in a way that we're still trying to work our way out of. An historic strength of the Union in Scotland that we argue in this book was as a framework that incorporated and indeed encouraged Scottish distinctiveness and, in parallel, an identification of Britishness. And this was built on this idea, and this is flexible and changes throughout different eras, but built on the idea of the Union with Scotland as a partnership, built on flexibility, asymmetric relationships, etc. Okay. Now, some people would see within that flexibility an incoherence, and maybe we're at the stage now where the incoherence is becoming more visible than the flexibility. But I think that strand of thought and the disappearance of that strand of thought of a partnership and of even the old, what historians would call the nationalist unionist tradition, or the unionist nationalist tradition in Scotland, of Liberals, Conservatives or Labour standing up for Scotland as unionist parties, that strand of opinion has been lost. Of course, if you think about the issue of consent and national consent and relate that to Brexit, cross-community consent in Northern Ireland is, of course, additionally complex to achieve. And, as I don't need to tell anybody here, the Northern Ireland Protocol has been enacted in Northern Ireland without the support of any elected unionist representative at Council, Stormont or Westminster level. And now, obviously, this and the initial Brexit vote in 2016 against, in particular, the overwhelming wishes of the nationalist community, put these together, and this is a profound challenge to both the devolved architecture of Northern Ireland and this consociationist architecture that we're still holding on to, or maybe pretending to hold on to, I don't know, in Northern Ireland. More broadly, we would argue that this era of politics in Northern Ireland, bridge building and respecting both unionist and nationalist sensibilities and ultimate mutual vetoes and power sharing has become unfashionable. Somewhat ironically, this has become unfashionable in an era when all sides of the Brexit narrative discussions conjure up the spirit of the agreement at the same time. So we would suggest that Brexit has made ideas about partnership of the union a tougher sell, and has made borders and choices blunter going forward. And this, of course, all has been in the context of a decade of economic underperformance for the UK and struggling public services as well. Finally, with regard to this part about Brexit, so far, the legitimate grievances, regional inequalities, the political disquiet that drove the Brexit vote has not produced a renewed British national story or a coherent agenda of even what that would look like at this stage, and instead has provided new layers to regional and national divisions within the Union. Beyond, return just to focus on Scotland and Brexit for a little while. Beyond the short-term party politics of the Brexit decision and the anger of many Scots at the decision, Brexit also raises serious economic and strategic questions for Scottish nationalism. Setting new customs and single market borders was always going to have implications for the border of Ireland, the border in Ireland, but it also dramatically shows the challenges that any future independent Scotland within the EU would face with English neighbours outside. In summary, Brexit may simplify the political arguments for Scottish independence, but it complicates it as a practical matter in many regards. I also think it's interesting that these discussions about trade borders, the nation state in Northern Ireland and Scotland are happening in the wider context of the nation state and statist economic policies becoming more fashionable and back on the table across liberal democracies in a way that they maybe weren't in the late 90s moment that Graham is talking about. It's interesting to think, well, what does a national energy policy or what does a national industrial policy look like in the era of the Northern Ireland Protocol? Or what does that look like in the era of SNP governments in Edinburgh who are quite confident that independence is just around the corner? What do those kind of national policies look like? Just want to move on now and talk a little bit about, if you think of referendum politics, who are the floating voters in these two jurisdictions and what do they look like? We're suggesting that the twin forces of unionist nationalist divides and Brexit have reinforced existing trends within both jurisdictions, but they've also opened up new electoral divisions. In the midst of this fragmentation, we can broadly make out the parameters of a middle Scotland and a middle Northern Ireland that potentially will decide the future of the Union or any potential border votes down the line. Briefly, with regard to the others, as they're called in Northern Ireland, I think it's an interesting to observe how little the class dynamic is talked about with the others in Northern Ireland. That this is predominantly, if we go back and pull data, this is predominantly a middle class phenomenon. And the idea of a community that could be persuaded to support a variation of Irish nationalism being marked by education and essentially middle class criteria, I think that's something that's underexplored in a lot of the discussion of contemporary Northern Ireland. What does that mean in particular for working class communities, disadvantaged communities, who previously would have been part of variations of progressive politics in Northern Ireland, but now progressive politics means really indicators of education or higher levels of education and different professions. So we do have another commonality between Scotland and Northern Ireland is this marginalisation of working class unionist communities in both places, and them being defined in, this is not new for Northern Ireland, but them being defined as loyalist communities in Scotland, and them feeling outside the cultural conversation, the political conversation in both places. Just to think about the floating voter in Scotland, we kind of think, what does middle Scotland want? It's interesting to remember, amongst the whole Brexit discussion, it's often forgotten that a third of SNP voters, or just under a third of SNP voters, voted for Brexit. That there's, I think, if you judge, there's about 15% of the population in Scotland voted yes to independence and Brexit overall. Okay, so that's one of the forgotten tribes. You could also say the 40% of people from Northern Ireland from a Protestant background who voted Remain is another forgotten tribe of Brexit, the Brexit wars. But if you take this 15%, or we're thinking of the middle Scotland, if you envisage the floating voter in the constitutional issue in Scotland, a good starting point is those people who voted no in 2014 and then voted Remain in 2016. And where do they go in this conversation? And I think that's a good starting point. I've also got another excellent slide to show that. I'm not sure if anybody can see that. But it's interesting polling recently asking about different aspects of the Union and what Scots, and in particular people in favour of independence, think of these different aspects of the Union. So a comfortable majority of Scots and a majority of pro-independence supporters in Scotland, for example, favour maintaining a common UK pension. They favour maintaining one welfare social security system. You know, they are in favour, a majority are in favour of maintaining the British Armed Forces. A majority are actually in favour of retaining Trident. So that's the majority of the whole Scottish population. Okay, so one interpretation of that is this kind of like it's like the Scottish independence version of the Keckism that we had with Boris Johnson, ATEL. A more positive interpretation is that this is the kind of common ground that, you know, could unite different people in Scotland, or maybe a kind of reformed union has that as a starting point, that these kind of divisions can be managed. But it is striking that these sections of Scots who favour these kind of parts of the social union, as they like to call it in the language across there, that's still not enough for them to favour the UK. That's, you know, they're still yes voters, and I think really what that says is that the pro-union side has not come up with a narrative or a story to tell that makes sense of these fragmented little pieces of unionism that remain broadly within Scotland. And I think this points to a broader issue of really a wider, I think crisis is the right word, a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of just the United Kingdom not functioning well for its citizens across the UK. And in another excellent slide, I was going to point on to how you can look at regional inequalities across England to show parts of the northeast of England really struggling. Actually, the highest levels of poverty being in the northeast of England now, okay, with many key indicators. And this is an area where conversations about devolution, conversations about power, and conversations about poverty are starting in the northeast of England and other parts of England as well. So I really wanted to just point out that this is a broader, this kind of starting point of Northern Ireland and Scotland leads to a broader discussion about what the future of the constitutional arrangements are going to be for the UK as a whole. And I think key part of that conversation is what is the role of central government throughout the Union. You can have conversations about a move towards a federal system. You can have conversations about a more muscular unionism, which has become fashionable again, a kind of suspicion of devolution. That's fine, but there needs to be, according to our opinion, there needs to be clearer lines of how central government for the UK impacts positively the lives of people across the United Kingdom to try to develop a sense of common purpose or endeavour going forward. And I might just leave it there. Okay, thank you.
So thanks so much, Graham and James. You are prepared to take questions, correct? Brilliant. So we will start with questions maybe from the room. We have an audience elsewhere as well. Luke, I don't know, will they be able to come in if they wish later on?
Yeah, they can put it in the chat.
No problem. So if we've questions at the moment, is it better the speakers stay where they are or stand here, or?
That's worse.
Okay. Shall we begin?
What else wants to go in? I'll have a crack.
Adrian Galkin.
Presumably when you were preparing the book, basically the Conservative government was still a working proposition at that point. Since you wrote the book, the Conservatives look like dead nuts. And that seems to me to make an immense difference to the prospects of, Brexit being partially reversed, maybe not, fully reversed, difficult to see, but at least partially reversed. And it puts, a whole new dynamic, a different kind of dynamic interplay, and what do you feel about that?
Well, we submitted the book, and then in the 2 weeks that followed, Liz Truss became Prime Minister and stopped being Prime Minister. The Queen died, and there's a wee bit happening. So I think that's right, and that this it does raise the possibility. This is one of the unknowns: is the actual viability of a UK Labour government being elected. Probably still only with a handful of Scottish seats, although the polls are variable in that. That is a key unknown, and that's why it's interesting to think about what the Labour Party is actually saying about these issues now, which is contradictory in places and whatever, but it still led by Gordon Brown. This debate within Labour, that I think you're right. That is a key issue now and an unknown, and it does show that there is, as I was trying to suggest with the conversation at the end about inequality within England, there is a sense that this might be another moment for a new constitutional rearrangement, right? And now that's obviously very unpopular within sections of unionist opinion across the UK, who would point, not without reason, that the idea that the arrangements in 1998-99 were going to kill nationalism dead, as was said at the time, didn't quite transpire. But I think there is a moment. There is a moment where this has become a possibility, and that I think does relate to the party politics of GB.
Yeah, I mean, if we can anticipate a Labour government, in relation to devolution, I think they will have to avoid making the same mistakes they did in the past, where there was this devolve and forget kind of approach on the part, certainly, of the Blair government up until Brown became Prime Minister, and even afterwards. So, as James is saying there, I think that if a Labour government came back to power, it's likely that they would have clawed back some ground in Scotland anyway to help with that, to help come to power. So they would be in a position then, I think, to address this, but they would have to, I think, be quite radical. They would have to be serious about respecting devolution, about entrenching devolution, and of course, many issues or some recent issues have called into question this whole tension between central government and devolved governments. I think they would probably have to follow some of Gordon Brown's prospectus here in terms of actually entrenching devolved government's rights, and maybe proceeding or laying the ground for a federal UK. But I think if they go in and they're rather tame, or they repeat past mistakes, then this could give another fillip to nationalism in Scotland.
Yes.
What would be the effect of a shaping government?
A large question.
Yeah. Well, the effect up here, I think, would clearly be a very profound one in terms, again, of, I suppose, the community divide, the fears of unionists, the fears for the future. In terms maybe of across the water in Scotland, again, it might strengthen that notion which is current in Scotland, that we are proceeding inexorably towards Irish unity, that Scottish independence will come, Irish unity will come. There's a sense in which that is in the air, and I think, as James said, the pro-union side have not constructed a narrative that persuades enough people to challenge that, or to move away from those assumptions. So I think if Sinn Féin came to government in Dublin, it would probably have the effect, in the short term anyway, of reinforcing those perceptions in Scotland and making the job of the pro-union side all the harder.
Jeff Dudgeon.
Thanks for the talks. A couple of questions, maybe one for Greer and one for James. James was talking about the sort of people who vote for independence in Scotland who actually want to keep the UK in place, or all the good bits of the UK. And to my mind, that indicates that the vote for Scottish independence is somewhat fake. But you can get referendum results that are unexpected, like the 1918 election in Ireland when Sinn Féin demolished the Irish Parliamentary Party and got independence, whether they really wanted it or not. And the second question relates more to
Large questions.
very brief question to Graham is what are England's strategic interests in keeping either Scotland or Northern Ireland in the Union?
Well,
Those are really that's unfair to ask proper serious questions.
I'll come to the second one first, Jeff. Strategic interest. Well, I mean, I think a UK with Scotland clearly matters more in terms of soft power abroad, shall we say. The notion of the United Kingdom is stronger abroad in terms of their influence. A rump UK I don't think would have that same weight. So I think there are considerations of that kind going on. Also, I think there's a way of looking at the union, which, again, I think there are some in the pro-Brexit side, the Boris Johnsons of this world and so on, who quite frankly would be happy to see Scotland float away, would be happy to break the union, have this, very unitary notion of what Britain is or the UK is. However, there's the alternative point of view, and this is becoming, I think, more of a fault line in those who would argue for the union, is that there are those who see Britain and the UK in those unitary terms, and the muscular unionists, as James has referred to them, who really, have no patience anymore with devolution, who want to get heavy from the centre, and those who accept that the UK is diverse, that you have to have institutional diversity within it. You have to respect that. You have to respect all that distinctiveness within the UK. And that you therefore proceed on at least a quasi-federal level. So I think for those who, in the latter camp, Scotland is vital. Scotland matters in terms of that overall view of the Union as a diverse collection of different parts, but pulling together in crucial ways. So I think that for people who view the Union in that way, or view the UK in that way, losing Scotland would be catastrophic. But for others, as I say, a lot of the Brexiteers seem to me to be quite complacent about this. They seem to think, well, it's more trouble than it's worth, let them go. They're a drain in our finances, da-da-da-da. So, they have no patience with what the Blair government put into place at the end of the last century. It's always, I think, been my view that it was never in the interest of unionists, either in Scotland or Northern Ireland, to have a resurgence of rhetoric around sovereignty and the unitary state. That is going to make the case for the union in both of these places all the more difficult to argue.
I'd like to just quickly say, respond to Jeff, that absolutely, you can see contradiction with what voters want. But as in 2016, voters who wanted to keep the benefits of the European membership of the European Union but want to out, they won, and reality follows that vote. It's the idea that 45%, at least 45% of Scots have consistently favoured independence, that a majority of people in Glasgow favour independence, and voted for independence. That still strikes me, something of my generation, is quite extraordinary, and that's not really been properly integrated into how we think about the mental geography of what the UK means. So once you win a referendum, you won. Reality follows, would be my take.
Anything happening online?
Not yet.
No.
Yes, so
They're working on it.
Question.
I was just wondering, you probably answered in terms when you refer to the does your book actually come to shortcomings of the 1990s devolution settlement? And what I view is that there was a lack of a formal body in which the centre, as in Westminster, could formally interact with various devolved institutions, such as, well, perhaps recently when Theresa May set up the Joint Ministerial Council, but I think that's a bit half-baked. But does your book cover that, and the fact that there needs to be like a formal way in which both the devolution parliaments and the centre can formally interact and in constant contact with one another, and also perhaps prevent the sort of bashing and complaining and always expressing like your crap and all that type thing.
I'm not sure that everybody will have heard that, so maybe in replying, if you
Well,
just
I think
highlight
the question's
question.
about the weakness of intergovernmental relations since devolution came into being, which I would entirely agree with, and we do touch on it in the book. I mentioned earlier about the Labour governments in the early 2000s having a kind of devolve and forget approach. I think this in many ways was fatal. They didn't work hard enough at establishing mechanisms through which the different devolved governments could work productively with the centre. I think that's one of the main weaknesses of the whole thing. There were these joint ministerial committees, but they proved pretty ineffective. Not everybody around the UK attended them at the same time. So I think that this is one of the main areas that any incoming government who are minded to reform the devolution arrangements would have to tackle. And it would be vital, you're quite right, because I think that a lot of the unrest, I suppose, that's benefited the SNP in Scotland was around this notion that we're still being controlled too much by London.
And I would just add that there is an argument about how the East-West dimension of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement can play a role in this here. And of course, that's relevant to wider discussions about British-Irish relations. But absolutely, the need for stronger institutions, but it's also clear lines about what the roles and responsibility of central government are in the UK. If anybody who's from a pro-union position, I think that's kind of central to a lot of these discussions. I would also just say that, of course, one of the ironies of this, many ironies of this process, one of the ironies is that these constitutional arrangements are hugely disproportionately the workings of Scottish unionists, of Scottish Labour politicians, the New Labour project, Brown, Blair, Donald Dewar, Robin Cook, George Robertson, Charlie Faulkner. You know, it is one of the ironies of these processes that these were Scots that defined this process, Scottish Labour people that defined this process and this settlement.
Question there.
Yeah, I was thinking about, obviously there are ties that bind Northern Ireland and Scotland. Where does Wales fit into this? Because it seems like Wales was also impacted by Brexit, but maybe in a different way. And how are the conversations around these two impacting Wales?
Yeah, that's always the way that the poor Welsh are forgotten in these discussions, and it's one of the this horrible phrase Brexit tribes. But one of the facts that's always forgotten is a majority of there is obviously an English nationalist strand to what's happened with Brexit, but so often it's forgotten that a majority of people in Wales voted for Brexit, and the same issues, particularly in parts of post-industrial issues. Post-industrial parts of Wales, that there's commonalities. There's commonalities in post-industrial Belfast to why some people in unionist communities voted for Brexit, as there are in the northeast of England and the north of Wales. And we are seeing a more assertive not small n nationalism within Wales. It's even, you can see within elements of what the Labour administration are doing in Wales, that there is more of a Welsh identity to that politics, and that's part of the complexities of trying to figure out what the United Kingdom looks like. But it's actually a key point, and it's one that we perhaps, because of the focus of the book, only maybe we could have said more about, is that this is also a story this is an English story and a Welsh story as well.
I think maybe things are very different now in Wales, I think, in terms of the political climate and political temper. But Wales, in a sense, came late to devolution because they voted it down very emphatically in the 70s and just squeaked over the line in 1999. So there's a sense in which, you know, the Welsh were not driving the question of devolution. But since then, I think devolution has settled down in Wales. There's been a change. There's a more favourable approach now, or attitude towards it. But I think in terms of our book, we had to factor in that the number of cultural connections and so on over the years, and the whole sectarianism question and so on, which, you know, obviously matter more in terms of the Scotland-Northern Ireland relationship.
Liam Kennedy.
When I think of Wales, I think of Sasha Bay's game. But just reaching beyond Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland to Spain and Canada. I mean, it's interesting, the last, I can't remember the year now, but the last referendum for independence in Quebec, which went incredibly close to 50%, 49 point something, in favour. But since then, that tide has receded quite radically. It's a bit early to say, but in the case of Catalonia, the drive for Catalan independence, which again came incredibly close to 50%, and in some opinion was just about 50% in favour of Catalan independence. Current indications are that that tide is also receding. So, on the basis of a sample of two, one might wonder if there's something, if it's incredibly difficult to get over the 50% a radical breakup of an existing political entity.
I think that is an open question about momentum and loss of momentum. And so part of the strategizing, obviously, with the UK central government's decision to basically veto a second referendum, despite the Scottish Parliament voting for it. I mean, there's good arguments for that, you know, in terms of, you know, the last one was 9 years ago. There's not particular polling data that supports there's been a massive change in people's minds. But the real political argument is a sense of, well, if we halt this now, this can stop the momentum, and where does that energy go? Does that, and I think that still is an open question. And you did see temporarily, I think this is right, in a month or two after that decision and the Supreme Court decision, you just saw a little uptick in support for independence, and then that seems to have petered out for political reasons. Who knows in the last wee while? But it is that question of, you know, where does that momentum go if the actual route to a second independence referendum isn't clear? If you have a majority of the Scottish Parliament wanting a second referendum, but it's closed off, well, where does that go? That could go in a very angry direction, and some people might understand that, or it could dissipate. I think that remains an open question. But obviously, the long term, it depends on having the consent of the majority of Scots. You know, you can play political games in the short term, but, you know, medium to longer term, you know, need to the union cause, the pro-union cause needs to win converts if it wants to survive.
Yeah, I mean, I just add to that John P. McIntosh, who was a Labour MP who was very much in favour of devolution back in the 70s, when the SNP were making waves, tried to explain to his colleagues that there was this dual sense of identity in Scotland, Scottishness and Britishness, but that Scottishness was the default setting. So that if the Britishness part of it looked less and less credible, people would gradually just say, well, you know, we'll say we're Scottish, we want to cut the British link. And there's a certain sense in which, if the British side of this is further discredited in terms of international reputation, in terms, and I know this is arguable, that of the effects of Brexit and so on, that this will have an effect of changing people's minds in Scotland, notwithstanding all the caveats to that which James has mentioned in terms of the practical difficulties of the notion of disentangling such a historic 300-odd year union. I think that's worth remembering, that notion that in Scotland there is this notion of having a Scottish identity as a default setting. It's not the case here with Northern Ireland Unionists, obviously, whose sense of Britishness is their default setting.
Katie Hayward.
Thanks very much. I look forward to reading the book. So when you talk about Australisation of Scottish politics, obviously it's meant to be sort of fairly pejorative and negative. I was wondering if there's anything from experience here that could potentially be positive. So for example, for the sake of argument, maybe if it looked likely, for various reasons, that there'd be a majority in favour of independence, that the UK government would commit to holding a referendum, would that possibly then diffuse some of the momentum behind the SNP, which is making the most of sort of a protest vote, apart from anything else, just to test you on that one.
So we're just not used to thinking of positive points. Positive to say. I mean, it's interesting that I mean, we have this discussion about the criteria for a board. I'm trying to answer your question by not answering your question. The criteria for a border poll, as we all know here, is very clear but also very ambiguous at the same time. So there's a kind of commonality. As a political decision across the water. I think the potential positive is just, as we're trying to say, to be more aware of these connections and to confront it. But overwhelmingly, I mean, just the kind of, as a value judgment, the idea of elections at every tier of government, local elections in Scotland now, elections to Holyrood, elections to Westminster, all being defined by the constitutional question. I mean, that's, it's hard to think of a positive spin about that, really, to be honest. And it, of course, echoes so loudly with here in particular. But so I think in the electoral sense, I'm struggling to think of a positive, but I think these broader connections, and as you're saying, this idea of thinking about the routes to constitutional change, there's something positive to think about there.
I think that it's a good question, Katie. Maybe if you took something like the debate here about integrated education, that doesn't happen in Scotland, and yet Scotland has separate schools according to religion. That undoubtedly is a factor in sectarian tensions in Scotland or parts of Scotland. But you just don't get people in Scotland saying, well, let's look at Northern Ireland. What do they do? And they have an integrated sector. Okay, it's still only 8% or whatever of pupils who go to these schools, but nonetheless, there has been decades now of these integrated schools, and you could certainly make the argument that a lot of those are very successful schools. So I think my point is that there is a great potential here for policy exchange. And it hasn't really happened. That in turn, I think, is a reflection of the way that the devolved governments and parliaments, as we said over here, haven't really interacted properly with each other. So that might be one area. It also struck me now, again, I don't really have personal experience of this, but occasionally it would be said that there's good committee work going on up at Stormont, which I think there was in a rather low-key way. I think a lot of things got done away from the grandstanding in the debating chamber. And they may have, there may be lessons there for the Scottish committees, because I've addressed Scottish committees and I don't think they're up to much. And I do think in these days, with the SNP very firmly in power, making sure that the chairs of the committees they want are in place and so on. I think there's less effective use made of the committee system in Holyrood. But anyway, that's maybe debatable. But there are ways in which I think we can find positive messages.
I advise the Scottish Committee on Constitutional Affairs.
would you like to develop on Graham comments? Sorry, I should have your name.
Miley Brennan.
Miley Brennan.
Yes, sorry, I have a way better question. If you could have this book in the hands of any one group or one person, who would that be and why? Like, who is this book really, like, you would want them to understand?
A good question.
Dear.
That's a question the publisher should have asked. Yes, I mean, we normally, when you come out with a book, it's an academic book, and you say, oh, but you know, the general reader will enjoy it as well. But in this case, I would hope there would be people outside of academic circles who follow politics in both places, who would get something from this, and perhaps see links and connections that they hadn't realised, whether we're talking in historical context or the contemporary context. I would like to think these days, of course, there are policy think tanks, there are various groups, lobby groups, and so on. I would hope that some of the things that are in there would be taken up by people like that who have political influence. I don't want it to be, and I'm sure James would agree, we don't want it to be confined to any political bubble, whether it's here or Edinburgh or London. You know, there are people, I think, who are very influential in terms of the political commentary, who I think, you know, we would like to see take it up. Journalists, policymakers, others.
Yeah. Struggling to think of it. Yeah. I'd like some family members to read it. But no.
I think an essential work for journalists and policymakers is quite good.
That's a fair answer.
Do you have anybody online?
Yeah, there are 2 questions from online. So firstly, what do you think are the similarities and differences between the ways in which what might be termed as culture war issues play out in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, and what, if any, are the implications for the future of the Union?
Does it say who the question's from?
Yeah, Sean McKay.
Sean McKay.
Oh, I know Sean, I shouldn't be asking some questions.
Thanks.
Issues. Well, then of course one person's culture war is another person's policy issue. So that's defining what's meant by culture wars. It's interesting if you think about actual culture wars that originate from here on orange-green issues, that we're seeing an increasing tendency in Scotland and the west of Scotland of them playing out on the streets in ways that are very familiar to here, as well as, you know, toxic stuff on online as well. So there are those similarities. Of course, there is a kind of broad identification in Scotland of the SNP with kind of liberal progressive values, and that of course feeds into a lot of the contemporary issues. It is interesting, and it's often the case here as well, that if you strip away political labels and actually look at what Scots believe and what values Northern Irish folk have as well, that the actual kind of views on social issues to do with immigration or sexuality or whatever, there actually aren't that many differences between unionists and nationalists in both places as their political labels would have you imagine. So I think there's those commonalities as well.
It's just, I remember reading, I think it was Pete Shirlow's people at the University of Liverpool had done a survey, and the group that they identified within Northern Ireland who were most pro-abortion rights and trans rights, gay rights, were those from a Protestant background who did not identify as Protestant. Or indeed unionists, many of them. So that's interesting, and I think there's something similar going on in Scotland, where I think a number of people who have swung over to the independence side think that, you know, independence will be a better atmosphere or context for the for progress in these areas. And those people too, I think, are people who you might say were from a Protestant background who no longer would identify as religious, who would say they have no religion. You probably remember the finding in the recent census where that category of people saying they had no religion here had grown quite significantly. It has grown even more in Scotland. And I think these things are tied up.
And then we have another question from Neil Jago. Have you come across any evidence that within Irish and Scottish nationalism, serious consideration is being given on managing recalcitrant loyalist minorities following hypothetical referendum victories?
I think the short answer to that is no. And part of the interesting thing, and it came up, you know, if you think of in the aftermath of the election results, the last Northern Ireland Assembly election results, is that you had actually SNP and Welsh nationalist leaders as well, welcoming and kind of congratulating Sinn Féin on their success in a way that a previous generation of any Scottish party would not have done. And there's a conversation there to have about obviously the changes within, generational change within Sinn Féin, but you have a sense that Scottish politics is talking about these issues and identifying with these issues in a way that it did not before, but is not willing to ask questions such as that. And a version of that applies on the unionist and loyalist side as well, would be my take on that.
And just to say also that, you know, we do refer to the outbreaks of disorder that there were in Scotland. It was a few years ago, where there were rallies for the dissident Republicans, and there was a loyalist counter-protest, which became very violent on the streets. And there was violence following the referendum in 2014 of a sectarian kind. And, well, I mean, one way of looking at this is that these are the old orange and green divisions, which simply map onto the Scottish question, but they do so almost the way that divisions over here map onto the Middle East question. They don't really, they care more about the original line of division, which is Irish related in Scotland, than they do, I think, about the Scottish question itself and what independence would mean. So that certainly is there, I think, in Scotland, and it flares up from time to time. And I don't think, you know, I think again, you know, there is a reluctance to address this. There's, I think again, it was one of these reports into sectarianism in Scotland. I think one that was commission that was chaired by Duncan Morrow of this parish. And that report made the point that the loyalist working class in Scotland is more alienated from the centre ground in Scotland than anyone else, which, you know, was really quite a striking finding.
Is that it, Luke?
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've had a really interesting discussion. Ties That Bind. It's a brilliant title. When can we buy it in bookshops?
It's officially out on the 22nd of February, but you can pre-order it now.
You had a promotion which the...
Yeah.
Oh yes, oh yeah.
And there is a discount code, Ties
which is on the other...
And it should be, well, it's not on the slide that's up at the moment. So
if you wait a moment, you'll see the discount slide and you can purchase this work.
Very reasonably priced.
I think it's a really important book. I think it's going to make a big splash. And I think, as Graham said, perhaps modestly, he should perhaps emphasize, I think it is an important book for journalists, for policy analysts, and for anybody who's interested in the politics of these islands. It's a really important book. I'd like to thank both James and Graham for giving us a really interesting session here today. I'd also like to say something else. We will usually have our seminar on a Monday at 4:30. But there are strikes over the next few weeks, which may affect us on occasion. And we don't actually have a seminar next week. So I'd ask you to keep your eye on our programme and keep your eye on our ads, so you don't miss any sessions in the future. And thank you so much on this Feast of St. Bridget, or first recognition of a Feast of St. Bridget in the other part of Ireland, which is important for us in our study. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.